Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on customer data management best practices for retail and QSR brands. I'm Alex McGuire with mParticle. I'll be hosting our talk today. First off, just a couple quick notes on housekeeping. If you have any technical issues at any point, or if you have any questions that you would like to ask our panelists, please feel free to use the chat feature, the Q&A icon at any time, and we will make sure to field those requests. We'll save some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to ask any as they come up. As part of mParticle's effort to help retail and QSR brands to use their own first-party data to take their customer experience to the next level, we're really excited to bring you two experts who have extensive experience working in and researching on behalf of retail brands and the marketing technology space. We're joined today by Michael Harrison, Managing Director with the Winterberry Group, and Austin Hay, who's Vice President at the Growth Practice. Thank you both so much for joining. And I would love if you guys could go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Great, this is Michael Harrison. The Managing Director, as Alexandra mentioned, at Winterberry Group. We are a strategic consulting firm that focuses on the advertising, marketing, data, and technology ecosystem. We work with the supply side as well as marketers to help develop their data and growth strategies. But what we're probably known most for, and really kind of the smallest piece of our work, is our research around areas that provide confusion in the market, such as CDPs. In 2018, we did a series of papers around identity resolution. Prior to that, it was onboarding. So this is our foray into CDPs, where we see a lot of confusion.
Great, and my name's Austin Hay. I'm the Vice President of the Growth Practice, which is a consulting subsidiary of mParticle. We focus on helping Fortune 500s understand, implement, and leverage marketing technology. Some of this could include CDPs, but more often than not, it includes the greater expansion of marketing tools that connect with a CDP. Some of our customers include Walmart, Postmates, JP Chase, Peet's Coffee, and a couple of others. And most of our work is focused threefold on helping people understand technology, helping them leverage that technology, and then helping them manage systems and growth marketing technology so that they can actually get the most output out of their tools.
Great. Thank you both so much, Austin and Michael, for joining us today. Jumping into our first question, maybe Michael, you could start us off. What is and what is not a customer data platform?
Yeah, I think so. When we went through this process for this paper, we interviewed over 30 of the CDP platforms of the 100 plus that have raised their hand as a customer data platform. And I think the confusion that comes from this space is that most of this customer data platforms came from a pre-existing platform, right? You have marketing automation that has come into CDPs. You have tag management, SDK platforms. You have customer intelligence platforms or analytic machine learning platforms. So they all have a different spin. I think what we have identified is that while the technology of platforms can provide adjacent services, at the core of what a CDP is the ability to ingest and integrate customer data from offline and online, manage customer profiles, and provide identity resolution, both from PII and non-PII, and then real-time customer segmentation to be able, and then making that data available to systems outside of their ecosystem, which is different than most of the MarTech stacks that really kind of focus on moving data throughout their ecosystem. The CDPs are there to power other applications. Austin, do you have anything to add?
Here's a visual on that too for you, Michael. By the way, Michael, I just want to make sure that everybody, if it's possible, to shut off the video and mute your lines, just to make sure that we can try to keep the audio quality as high as possible. So to apologize for having issues.
And Alex and Michael, I'm sorry I didn't respond before. It wasn't because I wasn't interested in it. It was because I was muted and I didn't realize. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily repeat everything you said because that's not useful, but two of the things that you stated that I think are worth going over is, first and foremost, a CDP is a tool that helps you orchestrate, personalize, and customize the experience across other marketing channels. A lot of people think of a CDP as having to serve some functional value, like sending emails, sending push notifications. And the term for that, at least in my mind, is like a foundational CDP versus an application-based CDP, which is something that Michael might talk a little bit about. And a lot of the tools that you see today that claim to be CDPs fall into that category of application-based CDPs. Now, that's not necessarily passing judgment on those. It's just providing a framework by which to outline and evaluate what type of tool you need for the purpose. In my mind, and with the types of clients I work with, typically they fall into the category of choosing best-in-class tools. And by that, meaning a CDP serving the raw underlying purpose of a kind of like a data conveyor belt to help get leverage out of all your other existing marketing tools, rather than a CDP that happens to be also really good at sending email or sending push notifications. So that's like a distinction that I think is very relevant for marketers, because that might not be something that they get right out of the box when they start evaluating tools.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think what we'll do, in the paper will be released this week, is we're actually making a call for the ecosystem to stop this confusion. I don't believe there can be an application CDP and a foundational CDP. A CDP is a CDP, and it's really the foundational. What we've seen is that these applications have built CDP-like functionality, light, to actually power their applications because there was a gap and that CDP wasn't there. Now that CDPs have evolved and have filled that gap, there's not a need for those applications to actually have that CDP. So to Austin's point, if you're building best in class, you want to look for a CDP that's best at managing the data, and then look for applications that are really powerful in deploying whatever engagement metric or tactic you're looking for.
Cool. Thank you so much. We have our next question. How are retail and QSR leaders using their CDPs today, and why? I think maybe Austin, if you're okay to give us your first answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I have to like wait in between you finishing the question and me unmuting myself. So apologies for the short delay. But I think when I consider retail and QSR, there are a variety of use cases that come to mind. One of the ones that's most prominent, perhaps because of the connection point between the two, is targeting and marketing users based on their physical location. Putting aside for a minute privacy concerns, because I'm sure people are thinking of the recent New York Times article about location data and how that interacts with privacy concerns. There's always been a push and emphasis on targeting users as they come into physical proximity to a store. So that's the connection point between retail and QSR. When somebody comes close to your store and your physical location, how can you offer them a compelling reason to stop by, or detect their loyalty, or give them an offer that makes it worth them coming by with some type of frequency? So when you think about retail, there's Walmart, Target, Best Buy, a variety of other contenders in this space who have physical locations. And in QSR, there's Burger King, McDonald's, many others that are in the retail space, the QSR space. And what combines both of them is the ability to target a user based on certain attributes and certain physical location. And one of the examples I pulled up here was just the one that has made kind of recent headlines with Burger King. They targeted users when they came into physical proximity with McDonald's location. And the question is, well, how did they do that, and how does that relate to a CDP? Well, the first thing is they have to have a technology that allows them to identify competitor chain locations. And it's actually fairly unsophisticated. That's just taking the location addresses of a bunch of existing restaurant chains and somehow putting them into a system that's smart enough to map when a user is physically close to them. So in this case, Burger King was using a tool called Radar, which allowed them to upload a big address list or lat-long list of geofences that represented McDonald's chains. And you're thinking to yourself, well, if they can do it for one competitor, they can do it for pretty much anybody else. And that's exactly right. They, they could upload locations for pretty much anybody that they wanted, whether it was Burger King or McDonald's. Then the question becomes, well, how did a CDP play a role in making sure that they targeted users effectively? This folds into the framework that I think Michael is talking about. They're using these best-in-class tools, Radar, and then in the other case of sending messages, a tool like Braze or Iterable, to physically send the push notification or the email. The CDP is central in this because it's actually creating this conveyor belt of data between Radar and a downstream messaging tool. It's tying user profile information, like whether they visited Burger King, whether they had purchased before, whether they had high propensity to actually visit McDonald's in the first place. So the CDP in this case was serving a central role for the QSR brand in essentially making sure that they had a single customer view that attributes such as location, whether they had propensity to buy, whether they should actually be sent the push notification. The CDP was containing that data and then forwarding it out to the messaging tool for what we classically consider orchestration. So when a trigger is fired from, say, Radar that a person has entered a competitor location, that messaging was getting layered onto the profile of the person in the CDP, in this case mParticle, and then that information was getting forwarded out either as an audience or as an action trigger out to their messaging tool to send the push notification or the email. And this seems like a very complicated thing to stand up, but what's interesting is based on the way that foundational CDPs operate, as long as you're collecting user profile information and you're creating this single customer view, it's actually quite easy to start layering in additional information about the user, like when they enter a certain location, whether they fire off a certain message. And I think that's kind of the beauty of best-in-class tools, is that each one has a very extreme focus on its functional value. And when you put these different components together, they actually are much greater than the individual components. And that's long been not just a marketing message, but a very strong value message for a traditional functional CDP, which is that in essence, the tools by themselves are not as powerful as the tools combined with a really good CDP.
So I think, I would add on, I think, restaurant or QSR and retail have always had a very complex data ecosystem, right? If you use Domino's, for example, while they don't focus on necessarily personalization of product because they have a limited number of SKUs, what they have done is there's been a decision to be wherever anybody wants to order. So whether that's in the car, mobile, voice, online, in-store, phone, what that does is create a myriad of data that is coming in. So being able to stitch all of that data together, create a universal view of their consumer so that they can understand the behaviors across media and their inbound channels and be able to act on that. A CDP is necessary. This has actually become more and more complicated, right? And the CDP really is just an evolution of what we saw of marketing databases. So in the marketing area, you look we had the direct mail where you had data brokers selling third-party data and some analytics around it, and then direct mail, right? Or shared mail for the QSR category. Then you move into the data-driven era where digital really becomes relevant and there's more, email becomes the primary channel over direct mail. And now there's a focus on kind of what is the life journey of a consumer. And then we move into omnichannel where where mobile has created vast amounts of data. There's cross-channel issues and cross-channel data that needs to be resolved. And now we're looking at an omni-channel ecosystem of not one channel is the best channel to communicate, but what is all channels messaging and having an always on, and then a machine learning and AI applications taking over from the traditional analytics to really drive the orchestration and optimization of the communications.
Yes, we are definitely in an omni-channel era today. And also those are some really great examples, Austin, from Burger King. Thanks for sharing those. Our next question. Oops. Where does the CDP typically sit in the enterprise architecture, especially within large omni-channel brands? Perhaps, Austin, you can kick us off.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, the diagram that I'm sharing with you here is kind of a well-known diagram, I think, from some of the mParticle marketing materials that you might have seen. But I think it actually demonstrates one of the better use cases for a foundational CDP that's out there. And in my experience, this kind of model for having a CDP at the center is not only like well expected, but highly valuable. And let me dig into that a little bit. So, you know, a foundational CDP at its core is supposed to act, like I said, like a conveyor belt. So this conveyor belt data of model means it has to ingest data sources from first party, offline, and any other channel you can think of where interesting and useful data that will serve marketing purposes is ingested. So for a classic delivery service like Postmates, that's the website, iOS, and Android app. It could also be a source like Zendesk, which is ticketing information. If you expand the model beyond Postmates, though, it's actually quite easy to start seeing how other interesting and rich data sets could be incorporated, like offline data, OMS. If you're talking about somebody has a physical retail location, you could even start to incorporate offline data related to users entering stores, and all that information is tied to what we call like a user profile or a customer data profile. This user profile has a number of what we consider user attributes. And those user attributes are essentially characteristics about a user that a marketer might use to target them. So for example, what's their propensity to buy? When was their recent purchase? What's their favorite store? What's their favorite merchant? I'm using Postmates as an example, but I'm also trying to elaborate on how a CDP should allow a marketer to capture really relevant, rich customer data. So all this information comes in on a user. It's all well defined by the company. So what's interesting here in this conversation, which we're kind of glossing over, is privacy and security. You know, the thing about a really great CDP is that you should have the flexibility to include as much or as little information as you want. And it should kind of pass the litmus test of giving you total control over what you encrypt or do not encrypt, and tie to a customer profile. Once all this information is stored in its CDP, then the question becomes, how do I leverage this data in additional sources? And then also, how do I enrich it, make it better, and store it? Those are kind of the two classic cases. And when you're looking at the diagram that is shown on your screen, I had just talked through this data sources bit at the top. This is just like one example, but you could consider it iOS, Android, Roku, Postmates, .com, retail, offline. All that information flows into the CDP. And then it is activated outwards in two ways. One is activation with tools, which you see on the left-hand side, and one is activation with marketing networks and marketing tools themselves. What's interesting is you're probably seeing the flow of information with these green arrows and wondering, well, what does that really mean? That to me is actually one of the most important pieces of a foundational CDP, which is the ability to take information that you get from other marketing tools and tie that to a single customer profile view, and then forward or federate that data out to other interesting sources. So in this case, what's highlighted is Branch and AppsFlyer, but I would argue that most of the tools on your left-hand side, like Braze, even Button in some ways, and Narrative, all have the ability to flow or feed information back into the CDP and enrich the customer profile view for uses in other sources. So for example, if you are a consumer with an app and you're acquiring users and you want to know their media source and channel that they came into, a really difficult problem to solve in marketing right now is getting that rich acquisition data out of your tool of choice, like AppsFlyer or Branch, and into a product analytics tool, or even like Adobe Omnichannel, so you can properly analyze the funnel of where somebody came from all the way down to how often they are likely to purchase. So a CDP is serving this really, really interesting and useful value prop, which is tying very disparate data sets together and then getting additional value out of them, which was one of the points that I think Michael and I stressed on earlier, which is that a CDP should hopefully take a lot of different marketing tools that you're using and make them extremely more valuable because it's tying interesting data sources together. And then the last thing I'll kind of close with here is, once you've started activating users and once you're sending data out to your marketing channels, once you're enriching profiles with your interesting marketing technology and tools, then the question becomes like, well, what additional engineering and product services can a CDP provide? And one of the biggest ones of a CDP is serving as this data conveyor belt to help you build a data lake or a data warehouse. Typically, there's this question with enterprises and startups of, we really want to own the data ourselves, but we understand the value of a CDP in serving marketing technology and serving a broader portion of our team. So how can we combine those two visions together? And I think Postmates is one example of a great way to do it, which is to get all the value and leverage out of a CDP as this conveyor belt for data, but then also realize that a CDP does not necessarily hold data forever. CDP is not necessarily supposed to be a giant data warehouse that stores all your information forever. Instead, you can actually use a CDP to take your data that's coming in from marketing and product and transfer it out to a data lake that helps you build that over time. So we've actually seen both extremes, startups building giant data warehouses of their own internal data from scratch, with the CDP serving as the head that pushes all the data into their data lake. We've also seen enterprises who have had so much trouble convincing a political organization to actually move towards one structure for a data lake that the CDP on marketing is actually best positioned to help that large enterprise build a unique and self-controlled data lake themselves, because it's so easy to have all this stuff instrumented for marketing and to flip a switch and suddenly it's generating a giant data lake for engineering. So anyways, I know I went into some of the details, maybe a little bit off tangent there, but I think it was helpful to describe the different sources. And Michael, I'll hand it over to you to see if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is just to add on to what you said, because I totally agree. I think that what we see CDPs playing in the data layer, right? So to Austin's point, they are collecting data. They sit either they're passing data back and forth to your data warehouse, and then they're powering the application layer. So this is where the confusion in the market comes in is if you have applications that say they're CDPs, they're not really sitting in the data layer. They're sitting in the application layer managing data. What we're really seeing is the platforms that do this well specifically sit in the data layer and then power whatever applications you want.
Cool. Great. That's really interesting stuff. Thank you. So this question, let's start with you, maybe Michael, on this one. What are the right questions to ask when you are looking into a CDP?
Yeah, I think at a high level, right? This could get very granular, but at a high level, you want to look at, does the tool capture and reconcile huge volumes of data, complex data? So can they take in offline and online structured and unstructured data? And not just be able to go point to one of your systems, but to actually go into the applications through an SDK or tag and pull that data into the platform itself. then once it's done that, does it resolve identities? Does it provide the ability to use external identity graphs to resolve identities? And does it take that identity and create persistent IDs so that you could track that individual over time? From there, does it provide profile management so you can manage the profiles and actually have an audit trail, so when there's an issue, you can go in and see how that identity was resolved and what are the inputs that actually created that identity? And from there, then you want to be able to do segmentation and audience deployment. So whether it is machine learning or just high-level segmentation and being able to build out segments to activate in your applications, and then taking that data, can that system integrate, and do they have built out integrations with the applications that you want to leverage? And if they don't have those, how difficult is it for those integrations to be developed and deployed? I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I can add a little bit of information. So I have like a whole standard set of, I would call them like characteristics or facets of a CDP that you should think about. I am of the belief that if you're going to go to the effort of integrating and buying a CDP, you should be extremely rigorous upfront about your criteria and metrics for how you rate that. I think one of the biggest mistakes that's made in the industry is that people tend to buy off of like the first thing they hear or the limited information that they get from the market. And that's not necessarily criticizing people for not doing enough hard work, but I think actually there's a deficiency in providing marketers and product managers with really clear evaluation criteria and educating them on the market. And so, there's that, and I'll come to that in a second. But just like as a litmus test, one of the first things I look for in a CDP is clear, open, and transparent documentation, because this technology is really complicated. And anybody who has integrated Salesforce or integrated Adobe or Oracle can attest that one of the biggest complaints about these massive tools is not that they don't work, it's that they're really hard to understand and really hard to set up and use. And so to me, that always comes down to documentation. And so like when I look at new CDPs, application-based CDPs, or when I assist clients in evaluating tools like this, one of the first things I always go to is documentation, because a lot of times people will take an existing technology that's been around for a couple of years and dress it up and make it look like a CDP when it has some functionality but is not truly fulfilling those requirements. So that's why I did the little pig with lipstick icons, because I think that's like a great analogy for docs. The second thing that I do is I typically have people assess a capability matrix, because the screenshot, which I'll talk about in a second on the right, is a very advanced way to look at a CDP. But what if you're like, a small organization with limited resources making a big decision, but you can't invest 4 or 5 months to really rigorously going through the process of evaluating CDPs? I think a capability metric is the first step to take to try to understand, first of all, do you need a CDP? And secondly, what are you trying to achieve, and how do different tools, including or not including a CDP, match up to that? So for example, if you're thinking to yourself, well, what does a capability matrix look like? It could be something as simple as, I want the ability to send audiences to Facebook and at XYZ. I want the ability to aggregate customers and be able to look at different profiles so I can debug better. I want the ability to catalog a bunch of events that I can use across maybe 2 or 3 marketing channels. That type of capability matrix is very useful in helping guide your evaluation. And then secondly, what I usually recommend is going through and being very rigorous about all aspects of working with a company. That includes, what integrations does a CDP have? What do you think about their account management services? Are you going to get the type of treatment that you want and deserve? All the other standard stuff like APIs, how the data flows, how do profiles merge, what type of segmentation and machine learning capabilities are available. That is kind of table stakes for me. I think a lot about all the additional stuff, especially as it relates to customer service, because what I found is that there is a little bit of an assumption in SaaS tools these days that if you pay if you pay anything more than 6 figures for a tool, that you're getting world-class customer service, and that's definitely not the case. So I also stress with clients to make sure that they've met the team that would be serving them, and they feel assured that if they have to call somebody on Friday night at 5 p.m., not only do they know who's going to pick up and help them, but they are assured that they're going to get the help and service that they're paying for. So yeah, I don't have anything else to add, Alex.
That was great. I think capability matrix is a really smart idea. So Austin, maybe while you're just talking us through, keep going on what's next for the CDP category.
Sure. I'll kind of paint what I think is next through some of the interesting stuff that I've seen Overstock doing. I can talk a little bit more about just the general space, but the 3 or 4 categories of topics are machine learning, orchestration, personalization, and compliance. I think I'll actually tackle them in reverse order because I think they the last one is probably easiest to talk about, and then we can go from there. So compliance and privacy, I think, is actually incredibly relevant and incredibly powerful, but it's just not front and center right now based on the way that at least the US has approached privacy law. If you look to the European Union and the focus and function of GDPR, it has really brought constraints on marketer and empowered individuals to take ownership of how they're being tracked, why they're being tracked, in what capacity, and the ability to opt out. And underneath those legal assumptions of what is allowed and not allowed, there's very sophisticated technology to help make it easy for marketers to obey the law, but then also get the most value out of their data in the tools they're using. So for example, if you're using a traditional CDP, and in a future world where GDPR, similar laws could be passed in the US, you have to ask yourself the question, are you going to be able to use a lot of these standard fare products to serve your marketing needs? And the answer is probably no. Can you imagine a world where you have a couple million customers and every single day you have to process thousands of requests not to be tracked, and you have to make sure that those requests go to every single one of the marketing tools that you're using, and you have to have a written record of it, or else you could be in legal jeopardy? That is kind of the world that I think is facing us in the future. So tools that take security and privacy and have easy tech around GDPR compliance are the tools that you should be looking at, because you don't really want to invest a couple $100,000, maybe even more, in tools and then find out, when Congress gets its stuff together in 2020, that the privacy law that is current is not really applied to the tools you're using. So that's why I usually tell folks, like, if there's not a profile API, or if people aren't part of open GDPR, which is a framework that mParticle and a couple other tools are part of, that it might not even just be worth your time and money, because in the future you're going to have to think about all these things again. And outside of the kind of boring privacy and compliance set of marketing, I think now we get into some really cool capabilities around the actual CDP function itself. And the first is personalization. That's like a buzzword that I think lots of companies like to use, but what does it actually mean? I think a foundational CDP, because it's just a user profile system that has attributes about the user that can be made available in real time as an API or in a batch, it allows you to start thinking about, well, what type of user experience do we want to deliver when somebody first comes to our site? What about when they return? What about when they walk into our store for the first time? What about if, in the Burger King example, they actually took advantage of that offer when they were about to walk into McDonald's? How do we then layer that data onto their profile and then use it in a subsequent visit? Because a CDP actually helps make the technology really simple to run these marketing campaigns, what it means is personalization is just thinking about the user experience. Like what does it mean for your company to be personal with a customer? chances are, if you've instrumented a foundational CDP correctly, it's actually quite easy to execute the technology. And I would argue that in the past, it was kind of the reverse. People had a lot of ideas about what good personalization meant, but orchestrating a very large organization to execute that type of technology was really, really challenging. So that's kind of the personalization bit. The other bit about real-time orchestration of marketing tools is interesting, because I think we've seen a rise in a variety of third-party best-in-class tools that are very connected to one another. And I'll give you a great example. Like, what happens if you're running user acquisition and paid campaigns across Facebook and Google and Instagram, and maybe you're using Branch or AppsFlyer for that, and then at the same time, once you've acquired these new users, both in form and function of a website visit or maybe an app install, how do you make sure you retain them via Braze or Iterable or any one of or maybe it's Salesforce Marketing Cloud? How do you make sure you retain them with an email or a message? I observe enterprises today, and the connection between acquisition and retention is very fragmented. So I think a CDP serves the core focus of orchestrating between very disparate marketing functions. Now, this all comes down to, I think, implementation and services, which is maybe something we can talk about at the end. But to me, one of the most interesting spaces a CDP is entering is just in the orchestration of very disparate legacy marketing functions that have never really talked to one another. And like I said, the classic example is, once you've spent all this money acquiring a new user, can you really be smart about how you target them on a consistent cadence? And then the last one is around machine learning. So if you buy into the idea and the model that I think mParticle and other CDPs push, which is like, a user profile that has user attributes, and those user attributes can be things that inform the marketing experience, well, then it's really easy to see how machine learning could help you, because essentially all you're trying to do is figure out new, smart, and interesting characteristics of a user that you can then leverage in your third-party tools. Like, imagine if you're using Braze or Branch or AppsFlyer, and you're saying to yourself, well, man, if I just had this one characteristic of a user, or if I knew a little bit more about them, I could run my campaign a lot better. That, I think, is the promise of machine learning on top of CDP. It can take your existing data set and somewhat automatically compile new user attributes onto the user profile. You could imagine if you're using like one of AWS's or Azure's out-of-box machine learning capabilities, it would require very little effort from your team. And that to me is pretty fascinating, that a marketing team could leverage very advanced programming and data science capabilities without really even lifting a finger, and put all that data back into the third-party tools that they are then using to optimize their campaigns. To me, that represents a very interesting opportunity for most CDPs. The execution of how it works is really key, because this goes back to our conversation around foundational versus functional CDPs. And if you're a functional CDP that really just is an email service provider or a text messaging platform with some CDP-like functionality, then this machine learning thing doesn't really matter. This really only applies to the foundational CDPs that have the capabilities that Michael outlined. So, Michael, I know there's a lot, but maybe I'll pass it back over to you to talk a little more.
No, I think you're spot on. I think compliance and privacy is key, right? I think that we are hearing from our sources that there will be U.S. regulation by the end of the year. So to kind of cut off CCPA, right? It'll be somewhere less than CCPA, but very much more stringent than current. So this has to be a cornerstone of the CDP. On the personalization and the real-time orchestration, I think what we're going to see is a shift to what we're hearing called the headless applications, right? In the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen every application kind of want to build their own brain so that they're stickier. But what that means is that you've got your decisioning happening in your personalization engine. You have decisioning happening in the ESP. You have decisioning happening in the DSP. And that doesn't allow for omnichannel orchestration. The only way to really do that is to have one brain that can then power those applications. And that's where the headless application comes from, where they no longer have a brain. The brain is happening at the CDP or customer intelligence platform level and sending the information out to the applications for execution. Right. I think that's where we'll see this evolve more and more. So that will allow us to actually fulfill the dream of omnichannel marketing. In addition to that, I think the one that I would add is I think the natural extension for CDPs, and we're already starting to see some of these core CDPs built out this capability, is attribution. Because if you are the conveyor belt, to Austin's point, of data, and you're bringing all of the data and you're resolving the identity within a system, it is a natural adjacency to actually continue on to do attribution and provide those attribution tools. Whether you build the attribution tool within the CDP or you power third-party attribution tools, this is a natural progression for the CDPs, and it solves a major problem in the industry with attribution getting false reads because of the data inputted into the application. And that is all that I have for the future.
Sounds like a lot of activity coming in the future. We did have one relevant question that definitely wanted to ask you guys. So this comes from Alex. Thank you for the question. Adobe Marketing Cloud sits on the application layer and not the data layer, thus not a CDP, correct? If so, why does being on the data layer make it better, given the other is still needed?
Well, I'll update that. The Adobe Marketing Cloud sits in the application layer, correct. They have some data management, but not true database and data layer capabilities. So the data layer allows you to resolve all of the data issues and then make Adobe Marketing Cloud better. And I think that is, Austin mentioned it, right? These platforms, the marketing stacks are very powerful if you can have a data layer that powers them. What it becomes very difficult is if you try to manage the data throughout their systems. Because again, Adobe was developed from acquisitions of multiple tools, and having one center source of truth with the CDP, and then powering all of those different applications within the Adobe Marketing Cloud will make you more successful in launching and applying the Adobe. Austin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the most successful models that I've seen for Adobe throughout a variety of companies is actually when you have a CDP sitting beneath Adobe that controls kind of the advanced new age marketing data that you expect. So for example, tagging events and users on iOS and Android and web and a variety of other platforms, that is a classic and core foundational CDP capability that, to Michael's point, is not necessarily something that Adobe does super well with some of their Marketing Cloud SDKs, because those SDKs were developed after the fact. I mean, they're trying to build CDP functionality while dealing with the massive hurdles of and I hate to say legacy platform because that implies that it's bad, and it's certainly not bad. Just like a lot of very complicated and difficult technology, that I think somewhat hampers their ability to actually have a controlled, user profile system. Whereas some new foundational CDPs are built first and foremost to collect user information around a user profile with user attributes where events are tagged to them. So that data model makes it very easy for them to serve that core focus, which can then, propagate data to Adobe, propagate data to other tools. So I think to answer the question is yes, I don't necessarily think of Adobe itself as a CDP. I think of it as a large suite of marketing tools that can help enterprises. And classically, I think there's always a tendency to have resistance at a large enterprise with Adobe because people tend to mix and match terms based on what Adobe's tool sets might do versus traditional third-party tools. And I see this not only in the CDP space, but also in the product analytics space between Omniture and Amplitude, which we could talk about later if we wanted to.
and I don't think this is a new concept, right? I think if you look at a lot of the enterprise Adobe clients, they're doing that through their relationships with traditional marketing service providers like an Axiom or Merkle that are managing large marketing data warehouses that are powering Adobe. What we're saying now is the marketing database feeds and the CDP work in conjunction in that data layer that then powers Adobe to make Adobe smarter and allows Adobe do what it does well. And again, to Austin's point, not really manage that data because they've come from data from a CRM and a DMP space and not from an underlying data architecture space.
Great. We've got one more question from Mark. Thank you, Mark. Great customer experience in retail also involves the right product at the right store. Will the CDP in the future help improve supply chain and merchandise decisions for retail? It's a great question. Austin, maybe you have some thoughts around this one?
Can you repeat the question? It cut out a little bit.
Absolutely. Sure. Sorry about that if there's still audio issues. A great customer experience in retail also involves the right product at the right store. Will CDP in the future help improve supply chain and merch decisions for retail?
That's an interesting question. I don't necessarily think it's the role from a technology perspective for a CDP to then be informing product decisions, because the classic case you're pointing out is like, we need a product inventory and we want to know when a user navigates a store or looks at stuff in the retail experience, can we use the information about maybe what they saw or how they navigated the store in order to inform our merchandise, which then is like a supply chain thing. I think the problem with that is that typically a CDP is logging users and they're tracking certain events, and a physical impression of a product is very hard to capture at a technical level. Like you can imagine you're in a store, you basically have to have your phone on you in order to be tracking the user's physical location in the store. How do you necessarily track where their eyes navigate? To me, that's the technical challenge between the physical reality of what the user is experiencing and the product recommendation itself. So what I might say is that a CDP is better positioned to help stores tie the bridge between how people are using their phones in a physical retail presence and what product recommendations are available. So for example, you walk into a Target or a Walmart and you search for a product. To me, a very interesting application of that is, was the product available? Was it easy to find? And did the user actually execute the pathway to buying that product in store? So that's like a classic CDP model that you could help solve for, because you would be tracking the person, you would be tracking what their preferences are, you'd be tracking the store they're located in, you could track the event that they search for a product. And then if they actually purchase, whether it was offline or online, they purchase that product, you could actually tie the whole funnel together and start to do some analysis around, was the app, which is a big strategy for us, useful in fulfilling this customer journey? But I think that's separate from a supply chain analysis of what products are people seeing and are they useful and are they positioned correctly in the store.
So we have seen a little bit of this where they will take in that information, where a CDP will take in that information and be able to ensure that the messaging going out to the individual will, if there is inventory in store, that the personalization through whether it's an email can actually drive them to store. And if it's inventory is not, or that product's not carried in that region, then it is actually a drive to ecom. One of the arguments is, do you want to do some of that stuff in store? Because within retail, we hear the argument of endless aisles, and you don't want to narrow what's in store for inventory, because you could still always make that transaction online. So there is ways to personalize so that you can drive within the messaging to ecom if that product's not going to be available. But when you're in store and if they're out of stock, you probably want to drive them to endless aisles and to be able to transact online.
Wow, these have been some really great questions. Thank you, Michael and Austin, so much for taking us through all these answers and all this information. I want to make sure everyone knows that we'll be following up with the deck as well as a recording. And then within the coming business days, we'll also have the CDP report by Winterberry that will be coming your way as well. So, again, I want to thank you all so much for joining today. And if you have any further questions, also please feel free to reach out directly, and we would love to continue the conversation.